Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. And over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book, while on here, I shed some light on the big issues. Today's episode is about global supply chains. We'll look at why they are centered in China and how the coronavirus is accelerating the transition to the next phase of global manufacturing. Next, we'll look at the shocking truths at the heart of the modern healthcare supply chain, before finally looking at the return of nations and the future of global production in a no longer borderless world. Pummeled by the pandemic, nations have classified some workers and industries as essential and started calling for self-sufficiency in key economic sectors. Let's see how all of this will transform the long, snaking supply chains that bind our world together. In early 2020, global manufacturing shuddered as the vaunted global supply chains of the late 20th and early 21st century finally cracked. China's lockdown had caused a production shutdown, disrupting the manufacturing process for everything from iPhones to automobiles to toilet paper. It was so widespread and hit so many industries because, according to the UN, today almost 30% of global manufacturing is performed in China. Everyone had known this was a problem, but the coronavirus was what finally exposed China as a single point of failure for global production. It revealed our current intricate system to be efficient but fragile. Then, as countries around the world fought to save their economies, necessity forced governments, corporations, and citizens to sing a very different tune on globalization and global supply chains. France called for a review of the economic and strategic independence of all French industries and demanded full independence in certain medical supplies. The United Kingdom talked about asking hard questions and moving away from business as usual. India whipped out its spinning wheel and released an economic plan emphasizing self-reliance. Even Canada is talking about the profound and newfound weaknesses in the global supply chain. Globalized, export-loving Germany is reviewing its industry and calling for joint EU planning on supply chain risk. And even China, the world's factory, is fast-tracking projects to limit its growing dependence on foreign imports and technologies. And this whole time, Donald Trump, of course, continues to sing the only song that he knows. So what does this all mean? Is it all hot air? Would a vaccine and a democratic American president bring back the status quo? Unfortunately, no. None of this is going away because the world we've known for the last 30 years was built on global supply chains designed to find and seize the lowest cost anywhere in the world. Then the coronavirus came and forced everyone to permanently recalculate the old costs while adding in big new ones. The era of cost-first global trade was already waning because it had destabilized many essential countries, including the US, where it contributed to the election of a US president who says, quote, "These stupid supply chains that are all over the world, one little piece of the world goes bad and the whole thing is messed up. We shouldn't have supply chains. We should have them all in the United States," end quote. There's a lot you can say about a quote like this, but here's an important one. If this had been the dominant US perspective 30 years ago, entire countries would have been left stillborn. South Korea is a great example. About half of Korean economic growth is tied to international trade, and the only reason it developed was because it found a role to play in a globalized world. This is why it is a very big deal when Korea's economic minister says that, quote, "The global value chain that is formed around efficiency and costs will now reshape around resiliency and reliability," end quote. If this had been the name of the game in the 1990s, South Korea would not be the success story we know today. But even a pygmy South Korea would have looked downright prosperous compared to China, which has by far the most to lose in any reconfigured system of global trade, because it was designed to be the center of the old, crumbling regime. In episode 4, we already talked a bit about how globalization built China into what it is today. Now we'll dive deeper into the old global trade regime and learn why it was crumbling long before the virus ever struck. The whole system was really just waiting for something like the virus to break it. Global supply chains is really not the best phrase. Our Korean friend used the better phrase global value chain, which helps clarify that supplying and assembling parts is only a small fraction of everything going on. It also gives the appropriate weight to other important processes like design, development, sales, and marketing. The only way to explain why China makes less than $10 for every $1,000 iPhone it assembles. But value chains is still just a phrase from a popular 1980s business book. What we're really talking about are not chains, but networks. Our world is made up of a network of production and consumption nodes. It is not a linear chain where a part made in Malaysia is brought to Japan, combined with a Japanese part, sent to South Korea, combined with a South Korean part, before final assembly in China and shipment to the US. Instead, assembly nodes like China pull in parts, inputs, and intermediate production from all over the world before shipping final products to major consumption nodes like the United States. Take the long view, and this system of scattered yet interconnected nodes is as odd as it sounds. Before the second half of the 20th century, both production and consumption were done in a single country like the United States or within a single imperial network like the British Empire. What modern, US-sponsored globalization allowed is this division between production and consumption. It gave poor countries the opportunity to develop by producing for consumer nations like the US. Exporting to the US has been the basic initial recipe for the success of all the great development stories from Japan to Germany to South Korea. And of course, to China. Modern China was terribly poor until, like the others, it finally gained a production role in the global network and started exporting to the US. Its fortune started to change when it gained large numbers of assembly jobs in the 1990s and 2000s. Huge synergies appeared as positive feedback loops meant more companies kept moving production to China. And then China added fuel to the fire by subsidizing volume production in every industry, starving out the global competition with rock-bottom prices. Since no government or international entity was coming in to equalize the playing field, the options were to jump on board or to drown. The result of China exporting to the whole consuming world was not just mass production, but unholy levels of overproduction. People tend to think China makes a lot of stuff because it's a big place with a lot of people, so it needs all that stuff. But it doesn't. Remember, China is not a consumption node. It is not a consumption-driven economy. Its population is 4.5 times larger than the US, but its consumer market is still only a third the size. In practical terms, this means the scale of Chinese overproduction is unlike anything ever before seen in world history. China produces way more than it can ever hope to consume, and it does this in every industry. Just look at the auto industry. China's annual production capacity is about 45 million cars, trucks, and SUVs, but the Chinese people only purchase 28 million a year, and that number is shrinking, not growing. This means China has excess auto production capacity equivalent to the entire US or European auto market. And it has hundreds of electric car companies, all fighting to add even more production to this situation. The US last had this many car companies over 100 years ago. And a consumption and production mismatch of this caliber exists in scores of industries, from electronics to solar panels, and it has for decades. Years ago, this sort of mass supply-side action was necessary. It was how China built whole cities from scratch and accommodated hundreds of millions of new workers leaving the fields. But China just kept expanding this overproduction, long past the point where it could even hope to export at all. For many years, it has been production for production's sake. China's transformation into a major production node was a double-edged sword. Yes, it enabled more cheap goods in the US, but its unmitigated overproduction also created enormous costs that eventually showed up in the democratic politics of other developed countries. According to labor economist David Otter of MIT, this is why the US lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs during the 2000s, while Chinese manufacturing grew by 15 million jobs. The global economic pie has been growing these last few decades, but not enough to absorb a country with more people than Europe and North America combined. The losses were always going to be felt somewhere. By the mid-2000s, China's cutthroat overproduction even had a name: The China price, where a product becomes 50% cheaper just because it was built in China. So, how exactly did China manage those lower prices? Well, low wages were by far the biggest reason. Some estimates suggest 40% of China's manufacturing price reductions were the result of exploiting the cost difference in labor between China and high wage countries. Or, in other words, it was good old fashioned labor arbitrage. Cheap labor is the original and enduring reason why China got its early assembly jobs and why it became the world's factory. Without these low wages, nothing else it could have done would have mattered. But for years now, labor costs have been rising fast, especially along China's dense, highly developed coast, where its major exporters, financial centers, high technology companies, as well as 50% of its GDP are all located. Just from 2008 to 2012, labor costs along the coast increased by 20%. From 2011 to 2017, they shot up by 60%. This has placed China's most competitive economic region in a vice. For over a decade, it has been getting squeezed at the low end of the market by lower cost countries like Vietnam. Then at the high end of the market, it is competing against the most technologically advanced, highly skilled, and innovative companies all over the world. And this time, it can't just compete on price, and it can't get to those cheap prices on the back of cheap labor or huge volumes. Labor productivity is what matters. And just to give some context, American workers are 7 times as productive as Chinese workers, according to a 2017 Conference Board report. So even as China hit a critical mass of development and became first the third and then the second largest economy in the world, this very development had already undermined China's most important competitive advantage. And this is only one of the primary economic reasons why manufacturing has been leaving China. It doesn't even take into account all sorts of pleasant activities like China's regional antagonisms with Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, its frightening surveillance superstate, imperial behavior in the South China Sea, work camps, concentration camps, and ideological indoctrination programs in Xinjiang, intrusive overseas propaganda operations, and of course, hacking, piracy, and mass theft of technology and intellectual property. It also ignores how China's rise disrupted the economies and political systems of many countries, creating political blowbacks all across the world, including the election of Donald Trump and the subsequent US trade war. And then, like a viral cherry on top, the pandemic brought all the global production imbalances of our interconnected world into stark relief. During the heady days of globalization, columnists like Thomas Friedman could talk about a flat world where borders didn't matter. But what happens when globalization by itself doesn't seem to drive economic or political liberty? What happens when the country supplying the world with its essential goods seems to grow more ominous and frightening every year? By the 2010s, China had become indispensable in crucial global industries such as energy, communications, transportation, defense, and healthcare. And dependencies created vulnerabilities. We could dive into any of these industries, but with the pandemic raging, there is no better system to look at than healthcare. When the coronavirus hit, the US and Europe realized they could no longer manufacture the crucial supplies needed to keep their healthcare systems afloat. Globalization had converted the whole US healthcare system into an efficient, internationalized, low-cost, and low-inventory system. Local production could not scale to meet demand because it simply wasn't there. The US struggled to ramp up COVID-19 testing because it lacked basic materials like the swabs and reagents used in the tests. But US medical dependence on China is much more basic than the personal protective equipment, tests, or medical devices you hear about in the news. China supplies the active ingredients, raw materials, and chemical building blocks needed for the most basic and essential medical products. China is the largest producer of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, that go into all the prescription drugs and over-the-counter products found in pharmacies. For example, China supplies over 70% of the acetaminophen used in Tylenol, Theraflu, Sudafed, Benadryl, Vicks, and other products in pharmacies across the US. According to Rosemary Gibson, author of a recent book on the subject, more than half of the 4,000 active ingredients needed to stock a US pharmacy depend on China. A majority of all vitamin B2, C, D, B1, B6, B12, as well as coenzyme Q10 all come from China. For many of them, it is the source of over 90% of US supplies. And the US federal government has only a very limited picture of how bad the situation really is. Here's a line from the most recent FDA report on the issue. Quote, data available to FDA do not enable us to calculate the volume of APIs being used for US marketed drugs from China or India, and what percentage of US drug consumption this represents. We don't know whether Chinese facilities are actually producing APIs, how much they are producing, or where the APIs they are producing are being distributed worldwide, including in the United States. End quote. If this is how limited FDA knowledge of foreign production is, you can guess how effective its on-the-ground inspection and quality control in China is. U.S. dependence also extends to whole categories of prescription drugs such as antidepressants, HIV/AIDS medications, birth control pills, chemotherapy treatments, anticoagulants, and medicines for Alzheimer's, diabetes, epilepsy, and Parkinson's. And to make matters worse, even when these drugs don't come from China, they still depend on China. India is the largest source of foreign drugs, but up to 75% of the active ingredients in India's drugs come from China. In healthcare, as in so many other industries, all roads seem to lead back to China. And the reason why is the same story we heard earlier. Up until the 1990s, medical production for the US was located in the US, but then medicine, like everything else, got caught up in the globalization craze of the era. Irresistible cost benefits to shifting production to China, mass subsidies, coordinated Chinese government and industry action to corner the market, and an almost exclusive focus on production cost and consumer prices in the West made China an offer these pharmaceutical companies couldn't refuse. These vulnerabilities were already unacceptable, and now, after trillions of dollars in relief efforts and harrowing medical tragedies, they are intolerable. The Trump administration has already been working to move supply chains out of China for 4 years, and now it has just the crisis it needs to accelerate and justify its goal. And this won't change regardless of who wins the 2020 presidential election. Popular sentiment has already shifted. It doesn't matter if you are the progressive Slate.com or the conservative National Review. It doesn't matter if you are Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump. Dependence on China is seen as an undeniable national problem. An April 2020 Pew Research poll shows 66% of Americans now have a negative view of China, up 50% in just 3 years. And just wait until the full impact of the virus shows up in the next poll. Business sentiment has also shifted. In a recent industrial survey, more than half of U.S. manufacturers have said they are planning to make changes to their supply chains as a result of the coronavirus. And this time, it's not just talk. Even before any major policy changes, China was no longer as competitive as it once was. For the last decade, accounting and consulting firm Deloitte has tracked manufacturing competitiveness. Over this time, the U.S. has steadily moved from 4th in 2010 to 3rd in 2013 to 2nd in 2015, and now in 2020, it is projected to be 1st. Yes, the U.S. is likely competitive with China in manufacturing right now, and lower U.S. input costs, a more skilled labor force, and more efficient use of advanced technologies will ensure this remains the case for years to come. For example, an N95 mask only costs, on average, 5 cents more to make in China than in the U.S. Only huge production volumes and secure global supply chains let such a small difference make all the difference. Meanwhile, more national policy action has been taken to reconfigure supply chains in the last 3 months than in the prior 10 years. Japan has put up over $2 billion to move production out of China. Countries across Europe, Asia, and North America are preparing to do the same. It is about less Chinese production, but also more domestic production. The buzzword is self-sufficiency, especially for essential products and services. And again, this time it is not just talk. France has already said it is ready to nationalize key companies if need be. As if all this wasn't enough, vaccine nationalism is laying bare that every country will not be treated equally. Right now, dozens of biomedical companies are racing to create a vaccine. Nations are pushing, shoving, and fighting to be first in line. This is no pretty picture of global cooperation. It is basically a free-for-all. The US is paying to secure early doses for itself, and India has said it will limit exports so it can first vaccinate its own population. while other countries are prepared to steal what they can't buy. Everyone wished they had what they needed within their own countries. Global supply chains will not be remade in a few months, but the genie is out of the bottle. The watchwords in the future will be industrial diversification, regionalization, localization, and yes, even reshoring. A lot of this will be politicians selling promises they can't keep, but one thing is certain. China will be stuck trying to absorb its colossal overproduction amidst shrinking external markets, and this is looking harder and harder to do every day.